This is Caffeinated Risk, the podcast for security professionals by security professionals. Here are your two self-proclaimed grumpy security guys, Tim McCreet and Doug Leese.
Welcome, folks, to Season 5 of Caffeinated Risk. Our next podcast guest is Dominic Bowen, the head of strategic advisory at 2Secure, Europe's largest risk management consultancy. Dominic is a leading international risk expert, senior management consultant, and host of the International Risk Podcast. He advises CEOs and executive teams across multinational organizations on navigating complex risks, from geopolitical instability and cyber threats to regulatory upheaval and supply chain vulnerabilities. Known for turning uncertainty into advantage, Dominic blends deep operational experience in conflict zones with board-level strategic insight to help companies build resilience, act decisively, and lead with clarity in a volatile world. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on, Dominic. This is awesome. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast.
No, it's great to meet you guys.
What I wanted to ask, though, to start things off is, can you explain how you got into your role and a little bit about who you're working for? Because I found it kind of fascinating how you got to where you are. And more importantly, like we just talked about, the clients that you work with, without naming names, what's some of the work that you're doing now within 2Secure?
Thanks very much for asking. How I got into this is maybe not very linear. But I started once upon, well, actually, if I go back to childhood, let's go all the way back. Let's go right back to the start.
All right, there we go. Yeah, I like it. These are the best stories when you start back there. That's the best story, right? So.
When I was a little kid, Gulf War One, you remember Gulf War One? It was this TV news, CNN and Fox. Yep. They were just pumping news from the front lines in Israel and in Baghdad and all over in Kuwait. And as a little kid, I thought it was amazing just watching these aircraft carriers take off and watching them do their work, and then watching SEAL teams. There was I don't know if you remember the SEAL team that landed at the beach, and the journalists were already there. But just watching those things as a kid, as a young boy, was just like, oh my gosh. And I remember being really sad, going, there's not going to be any wars left when I'm an adult. There's not going to be any wars. What am I going to do for a job? Who's going to fly the planes? They're not going to need them anymore. And having this dilemma as like a 7 or 8 year old going, what am I going to do for a job? There's not going to be any work. But I grew up with this mentality, and it was partly instilled from my mum and partly instilled from, I went to Christian Brothers schools, that, if you've got a skill, if you've got an ability, you've got to use it. You don't have to be the greatest at anything, but you've got to be the greatest that you can be. And I remember thinking, that's pretty easy. If I was ever in trouble, if my community, if my family was ever in trouble, and there were some Iraqis that could help me, and they didn't, I'd be annoyed at them.
Yeah.
But if they could jump on a plane, either help with reconstruction, help with medical care, help with fighting, help with peace and stability operations, if they can help, then I really hope they'd get on a plane. And so that's just what I grew up with. And then, needless to say, I ended up in the police force and ended up doing policing, and then I went into prosecutions. Then I became a federal agent. Then I deployed overseas as a special agent and did some missions there, and that was fantastic. I then transferred over to the military, and I was a captain in the Special Operations Command. Obviously, a busy time after September 11 in Special Operations Command. Did quite a few missions in some great places there. And then after I'd done the stuff with the government, I actually got involved in the humanitarian sector, working with Doctors Without Borders, Red Cross, Danish Refugee Council. So between the special agent, the Special Operations Command, and then the humanitarian sector, I've worked in every major conflict zone. So I did Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Haiti, Sudan, and so on. And it's just been such an amazing ride. Really, it was every adventure I could have hoped for, and many, many more as a young boy. But then at some point, as we all do, we meet a girl, and and she worked for the Swedish government, and we were able to organise these missions where my mission would coincide with hers, and we kept that going for a while. Sure enough, eventually she has a child that happens to be mine, and she lives in Sweden, and I kept the adventures going for a little while. But there came a point when I just got back from, I think it was Haiti. And I picked my son up from creche or kindergarten, and he was, 4, and he's like, oh, fantastic. And I went, my headquarters, I hadn't even got home yet. I'd just come from the airport, and headquarters went, we need you to go to Bangladesh. There's this, have you heard of the Rohingya crisis? Yeah. And I was like, there's about 20 or 30,000 Rohingya that have crossed from Burma into Bangladesh. And they went, yep, we need you to go and lead a team there. And I went, guys, I haven't even got home yet. And they went, just a 5-day mission. And I went, I really can't. And they went, look, it's kind of 5-day mission or you're kind of unemployed. And I went, okay. So I told my son, I said, let's count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we did that. Anyway, about 3 months later, that 20,000 Rohingya population turned into 1 million. And 3 months later, I'm still in Bangladesh. And I'm having a call with my son one day. And he's like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I went, that's good counting, buddy. What is it? He's like, I think it's been more than 5 nights, Daddy. When are you coming home? And then you just realize you're now a horrible father. You're having fun, you're traveling the world, but you're a horrible dad. Yep. And as sure as night follows day, my phone rang and someone offered me a job to head up their international operations team at 2Secure. And, had a few more promotions in the company, and now I head up their strategic advisory team, and I'm a partner at the firm. Wow. So it's been a fun journey.
Wow. Now my kid's way older than 5 now, but yeah, to make that choice and to, like you say, as night follows day, suddenly you're in this position. But then the ability to bring all of this backstory into any kind of a corporate practice, I think it's interesting. I've worked with a few people now that are veterans or former law enforcement, and it's a very different reality when people are upset about spreadsheets and, compliance versus people getting killed or stuff blowing up. How do you balance that out? Because it's all relative. For somebody who's never seen any action, they think this is a big deal. And everybody's still got all their arms and legs. So, yeah. Relative to what I've seen, this isn't such a bad day. How do you bring that in without sounding like that person that says you don't know anything?
Yeah. And I think everyone has got their own truths. And, running late for the supermarket, running late for a meeting, we've all got these realities, and they are painful, and they all do cause us stress. And if we look at the stress curve, our heart rates go up, and we suffer the same sorts of stresses we can in a combat zone. But don't get me wrong. I remind my son at least once a week, this reminds me of that time when we were in Afghanistan. And, so I don't mind pulling the plug when I'm reminding my son to clean his bedroom and he finds it's a hard day. But when I'm talking with my clients, maybe I'm a little bit more generous. And often what I talk about is risk tolerance. And as you said, sitting in front of a computer and working on Excel sheets, working and navigating through office politics, honestly, I can't do that. I find that too stressful. Catching public transport in Stockholm when it's busy, especially during COVID when no one was wearing a mask in Sweden, I find that really stressful. I hate getting sick. I hate having time when I can't exercise, when I can't get out, when I'm stuck in bed with a cold. That causes me a huge amount of stress. Operating in a conflict zone, I travel to Ukraine quite a lot with colleagues. I'm as calm as the ocean on a beautiful day. That's where I feel good operating. But that's my risk tolerance, and I know that. I do know if I'm stuck in a 4-hour workshop with a board, like my own board with 2Secure, by the end of that, I'm done. I've got no energy left. But put me, in an 18-hour day on the conflict lines in Ukraine, I'm fine. Mm-hmm. I'm rocking it. But that's me, and I know that, and I know my limits, and I know where I'm at. And that's what I talk about with companies. Companies have risk tolerances. Now, some companies are really well unified. If we look at companies like Toyota, ask anyone from Japan to their subsidiaries around the world, they will all say we are a low-risk company. But other companies aren't low risk, or they've got a low risk appetite, but the other companies have a higher risk appetite. And that's a really important differentiation because the board has to articulate that, the executive team needs to implement it, and all the employees need to understand that. Now, your information technology and your information security team might think they have a high or low risk appetite. Your sales team, who have sales targets, or they lose their job, they probably have a much higher risk appetite than your information security team. Then your middle managers, those people going for promotion, maybe those people closer to retirement, they're all going to have different levels of risk appetite. But they're all meant to be synchronized based on that direction that we got from the board. So understanding risk appetite is really, really important because all of us have different risk appetite. And that's the sort of examples I use to bring it into the fore.
That's awesome. And I think that's one of the things that we talk about here often is trying to find that holistic approach to looking at risk, but getting executives to state it first. Do you find When you're dealing with your clients and when you're dealing with organizations, do you find that that's one of the more difficult tasks, is to get that holistic view of risk and getting them to communicate the same way? Because both Doug and I have worked on organizations where you can literally walk down the hallway on the executive floor and get different concepts of risk. Some can't even spell it, for God's sake. I just like, Jesus, are you serious? And it's how do you get folks who are coming from all these disparate approaches to managing the business? How do you get them to that space where they can say that level, that statement all together in concert? Like, how hard is that?
It can be really, really hard. I agree with you. And often one of the best things is to get it written down. But what I normally start with is one-on-ones. Never group think, because then people are biased. Yeah. Get them on one-on-one and just talk to them. And I'll say to them. So I'll start off with general questions like, tell me about what are the risks that concern you at night? Now, if someone can clearly articulate, okay, I'm a little bit concerned about this issue, I'm concerned about these operations, I'm concerned about this type of cybersecurity. Okay, this person's been thinking about it. Okay, this is great. This is good. How do you manage crisis? Okay, well, we've got a crisis management team. This is how we escalate crisis. This is how we decode. Awesome, great. Tell me about how you manage duty of care and workplace safety for staff when they're traveling internationally. Oh, okay, we've got this program. Great. That person leaves me with confidence. When you speak to someone else, they go, oh, we don't have any risks. Okay, yeah. You're very immature. When someone says to me, oh, I think it's maybe the head of communications. I think they lead the crisis team. Those sort of things. And then I look for red threads. So then when I've spoken to 5 or 6 executives, the chief of operations, the CEO, maybe a board member, maybe some frontline managers, then I look for, in Sweden, they call it a red thread. But what's that common link that runs through all of it? Yeah. If there's a red thread, great. Then when we do a workshop, all we're trying to do then is look forward. If there's not a red thread, then when we bring everyone together for a workshop, then we have to get that. Then we have to get everyone to agree. This is what our company is actually focused on. We're expanding, we're acquiring other companies, we're staying stable, whatever we're doing, we're going through restructure. Get everyone to agree on what the company's focus is, then get everyone to agree on what are the risks that can derail us. What are the things on a Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. that are going to punch us in the side of the face? And then what is our tolerance to that? Now, at that point, which is getting to your question, then they're starting to articulate what is their risk appetite. At that point, I'm less concerned. Sometimes I'm like, I don't think your risk appetite is high or is low. I think it's actually different. But we'll get them to put something on paper. But then you follow it through. Okay, how much are you willing to expend? Because if you say you've got a low risk appetite, but you're expanding, you're going to need to spend some money.
Right.
On maybe extra staff vetting, maybe on extra security measures, maybe on staff training. But if you're not willing to spend that money, well, maybe you are willing to accept more risk. So maybe you have got a higher risk appetite. But it's a process I think you have to go through.
As I was researching where we might go with this interview, I'd stumbled across this buzzword. It's kind of dated now, this socio-technical. Kind of says you can't really separate the people from the technology, and it's just part of our daily interaction, whether it's corporate or government or whatever. And then we've got the whole supply chain over top. But where I wanted to go with that, when you look at CrowdStrike last summer, or over here in Canada, we had a router upgrade a couple years ago that took out the cache for a whole bunch of people over the weekend. And yeah. If organizations recognize that things are very tightly integrated now, and they know that one mistake seems to mess everything up for a whole lot of people, why are we not building in some kind of slack or spare capacity? Everybody recognizes it's important, but it doesn't seem like it's a priority.
I think that's a really valid point, and I was actually speaking to a client yesterday that they really sit at the center of what's critical infrastructure, geopolitics, but even things like organized crime at the community level. That really they're touching on so many things, and all of those things influence each other. And I think you're right that right now there's still too many leadership teams that underestimate or oversimplify the interconnected nature of everything that we're doing. And the modern system, the globalization, and the CrowdStrike last summer is a great example. Even SolarWinds is another one where these single points of failure cascade right across multiple business. They can impact supply chains, geographies, national infrastructure. We look at the ship that blocked was it the Panama Canal or Suez Canal?
Suez Canal, yeah.
The Suez Canal, thanks. Yeah, the ship that did that. I met with a client 12 months later, a very large industrial company in Sweden that said, we're still suffering the impacts. And I went,
Holy.
I understand that was blocked for a week to 10 days, but how did that take a year? Is that still flowing on? And they explained the complexity and what that did and the flow-on effects.
Wow.
It's just amazing. And I think, there's quite a few points that can be made, but I think one of them is we've got to stop managing risk in silos. Just saying the head of IT manages information security risk, HR manages people risk, is too old school because risks bleed into one another. And we need to be looking cross-functionally across risks. And that's where, the chief risk officer in a company shouldn't be owning any risks. The chief risk officer should be a professional coffee taker and a networker and bringing people together. That is their job. We've got to stop managing things in silos. And we need to be taking the time. And I know this is easier said than done. It's easier as a consultant to come in and go, well, you need to be mapping your risks and considering the internal, external dependencies.
Yeah.
But, if you're a profitable business, then either employ someone, bring in people on a short-term contract, use a consultancy, but really looking at your external dependencies, whether it's your software vendors, your cloud services, your outsourced IT, but a whole variety of things, your transportation networks. I won't name the country, but there is some significant and concerning bottlenecks when you look at Europe's defence strategy and NATO's defence strategy in Europe. When you look at some single points of contracts around their logistics that have been outsourced, national infrastructure, railways, roads, just simple things that most of us assume, if there was an invasion, let's say hypothetically from Russia, could we move our soldiers and our tanks and our people to the borders that are likely to be invaded? The answer in quite a few countries would be no, which is just shocking to think that we've got these defence forces and we don't have the infrastructure because of these single point of failures around railway lines, the amount of carriages and the infrastructure. So we need to be considering that. And it's not just, government failures. These are, corporations and suppliers have these. But we don't ask the question. And some cultures are better at it. I think Americans, Germans, French, Australians can be quite comfortable challenging their suppliers and in a friendly and professional way, but just saying, hey, can we have a look at your redundancy? Hey, what happens if there is a failure here?
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of cultures that just naturally won't do that. They find it too confronting to say to a supplier or a colleague, hey, can we just talk about some what ifs? Can we do some contingency planning? Can we do some scenario activities? Not enough people are doing those things. And I think these need to start at the board. The old saying, a terrible saying, I still don't fully understand it, but that saying, a fish stinks from the head up. Really, if we it's a terrible saying. But, boards really need to take responsibility for the language. They need to demonstrate to the executive team how you question, how you dig a little bit deeper on the reporting, and then the executive team taking that and seeing that as not as a challenge or as a chest poke to someone, but as I care. Your job in managing risk is important. Your job as a frontline manager is important. And that's why I want to understand how you manage those risks, how you identify those risks, how you prioritize those risks. I'm asking because I care, because you're important and your job matters. And I think if we can start doing some of those things, we're going to be in a much better spot.
No, and I love that approach, right? Because it really comes back down to that human approach and being more empathetic. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I also love the idea of that the coffee taker. That's awesome because I think my first year at the government of Alberta, when I took over as chief, all I did was take people out for coffee because I wanted to get to know their business. Like I would ask. We had 28 different ministries. So I had to learn their business units, read their strategic plans and figure out where they are. But I spent thousands of dollars on coffee because it was just, hey, can I take you out for coffee? And then I would just ask, hey, what do you do? Because I wanted to know as much as I could about their business so that when it came time to helping them out, at least I had a business conversation. I got rid of the technology because I'm not that guy anymore. I haven't been for years, but I understood business and how they supported the citizens of Alberta. So I love that you talked about that. And I think you nailed it too, is getting the board and getting executives to understand the role they play. And then it's okay to ask those questions. Because I still have gone, and in years past and even now, I've gone to where people are uncomfortable asking those questions. Why? This is your business. Like, you rely on third parties to get stuff to your place, to build stuff, to make stuff, to sell stuff. Why are you not asking these questions? Have you seen that change, Dominic, over the last few years where at least they're starting to ask now, or is it still kind of a foreign trait for a board member to be able to put up their hand and ask a risk question?
I find that boards are doing a fantastic job. There's this in Europe, especially in America and North America, there is some just amazing business leaders, and just boards are just doing a tremendous job in driving companies. But I think risk is probably their weak muscle, and how much they dig into it, I think, is probably still the weak muscle. I think more business leaders, whether they're board members or executive teams, are starting to think it. And I think if there was some silver lining to come out of COVID, if there was some silver lining to come out of the Block Canal, if there was silver lining about when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan and China shut down the South China Sea for a couple of days, if there was some silver lining coming out of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, if there was some silver lining coming out of Hamas attacking Israel in October 2 years ago, those are all tragic and terrible, terrible incidents. But what they do is they're now forcing business leaders to think and to ask questions. Could this impact my business? I was actually in Ukraine the weekend that Hamas attacked Israel.
Wow.
And I said to some Ukraine colleagues, I said, oh, look, this is going to affect the news cycle. Ukraine's going to be lower in the news cycle because this is going to dominate. This is going to be huge. And my phone literally on cue started ringing from executives and business leaders from across Europe just saying, hey, Dom, what do we need to consider? And for many of them, the answer was, right now, your business is okay. On Monday, we need to have a conversation about HR, about what statements you might make, some of your vendors and suppliers around security software that often originates in Israel. Let's have a conversation about that. And for others, there was some immediate risk they needed to consider. But it was great. I really noticed a change that after 5 or 6 big crises or global crises, that business leaders are like, ooh, I need to ask that question. Does this impact me? Does this impact my business? And I think that's a fantastic development.
I think there's been enough good examples. I don't think people higher up are necessarily thinking this could never happen to us, but I think they also have a very tough job because there's not an unlimited amount of money to solve all problems, and there's not an unlimited amount of time. And I noticed looking through a lot of what you've been working on, you have a lot of involvement in public infrastructure. That seems to be a really neglected part because now there's not even profit around it. It's all tax dollars, and there's never enough of those. During your research and the work that you've been doing, have you discovered an approach to determining the priorities and balancing how that remediation might come about compared to all the other social needs that either a large organization or a government would need to address?
Yeah, that's a tough question. That's a really tough question. And we look at America, fantastic infrastructure or fantastic country, but many people that work heavily in infrastructure recognize that some of America's infrastructure has to be modernized. But at the same time, the average American is taking a big hit. We saw that in the last election, and that being one of the driving factors. It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
We've got to reduce the cost of living. At the same time as in the long-term interests of America, we need to improve some of the infrastructure. Now, conversely, we've got countries like India that for a long time, have been seen as this growing hub. I remember about 15 years ago looking at some analysis about India's ability to be this global IT hub, but it didn't have the infrastructure. Yeah. Now, there was a huge growth path that India was undertaking, and they did undertake that, and they've had some significant wins, and that's led to them having the ability to be able to provide the services and the growth that's now fueling further growth. It's a balance. This is a political decision. Hopefully it's a political decision based on a strong bureaucracy. But there's a big recognition in Europe now with countries, a couple of years ago, whether you like Donald Trump or not, people were calling it disgusting that he was threatening NATO countries with not supporting them because they weren't spending their 2%. Now, like it or not, his actions were a big part of countries saying, okay, we need to start spending more than 2%.
Right.
Russia's invasion, illegal invasion of Ukraine, and threats. There's been over 200 sabotage attacks as part of a broader hybrid warfare led by Russia in Europe. Over 200 that have been directly attributable to Russia. The message is very clear. Not only has Russia invaded Ukraine, but Russia is undertaking activities. We're not just talking about Estonia and Latvia and Eastern European states that many people don't even know where they are on a map. Beautiful, fantastic countries. But we're talking about the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Norway, Sweden, Poland, that have all suffered from attacks from Russian assets. So there has been a shift now, and now many countries, Poland's spending over 5% of its GDP on defence. Most of the Baltic states are. Sweden significantly increasing. We've seen the UK and France cut down on their foreign aid spending, which of course is tragic, but they're reallocating that to defence spending. And, some of that is around public infrastructure or public infrastructure related to defence. Now, some of it's dual purpose, roads, tunnels, train networks, but some of it is purely defence in nature. So we are seeing a shift, but how to prioritise that? Whew, people win and lose elections on that.
Yeah, that's the issue, right?
What about like an internal organization? Would they have it? Would there be an easier sell internally?
I think for a business, it's actually much easier because you've got profit and loss.
Right.
And that's where I always start with, if you're a pharmaceutical company or if you're a bank, what are your business objectives? What are you trying to achieve? And of course, there's lots of different business objectives at the micro level and lines of operation that companies are pursuing. And really, it's quite simple in business because you go, okay, if I'm going to pursue this business opportunity, I see that we're going to need to spend 10 million investing in this new market, and we expect to get 50 million back in return. Okay, that's a 40 million return. But and then you have to bake in your security, your risk management costs into that. And if you are doing that, and that's something that we've been working with a few of our clients for a couple of years on, about making sure that security, risk management, crisis preparedness is not an afterthought, but it's part of the budget. You include your sales costs, you include your costs to develop the product or the service, you include your salaries of your staff that are delivering the product or services. You also need to be including risk management. And part of that's IT security, part of that's physical security, part of that's having a good risk officers that are close to the front line. And really, then if you've included that and you've baked that in as part of your budget estimates, then you just consider, okay, are we expecting to get more of a return on this market? If we're not, well, then it's probably not a good business decision. So for businesses, it's much easier because it really is just a numbers game.
Yeah. No, and I agree, because that was one of the things we've been talking about this for years on the podcast, and even in our own careers, that the idea that security becomes part of the business by supporting the business and enabling it. And some of the metrics that we're able to demonstrate is if I can reduce risk and the business is able to operate without incident, is that worth the time and the effort for the security program? And invariably it's a yes. And that's where we were getting some of the greatest success, at least in some of the private companies I worked with. The difficulty on the public side, for me at least, in the roles that I had, is 4 years is an election cycle. The year before the election, nothing gets done. The first 2 years in, it's dealing with stakeholders and making sure you can actually function with the budgets that you're working on. So you have like almost a year to do as much as you can. And it became such it was struggling for me to watch some of this unfold. It's because the programs in nature were fantastic. They were there to support the citizens. They were there to build infrastructure. They're there to replace 20, 30-year-old pieces of equipment that have been there and should be replaced. But depending on the cycle where you are and what the stakeholder engagement is in an election, a lot of the stuff never got done or got pushed to the next 4-year cycle or the next budget cycle. And we're paying that price now in Canada and you see it now across North America, Canada and the US, where that infrastructure has been in field for 20, 30 years, and it's starting to show its age. You bring up some really great points. I think in business, they understand this concept of how do I support the profit, the goals, the objectives, the losses, et cetera. Public sector, it's more difficult because I only have, and Doug brought it up, I can only tax so much, right? Because if I'm in public service, I only have 2 ways of getting revenue, taxes and services. That's it. So I found public sector was more open to suggestions, less open to spending money, where on the private sector, it was kind of the reverse. Sometimes you had to really get the suggestion across, but the money was there. And as long as, I used to love getting these conversations that we don't have any money. No, I don't have money for you. They don't trust you yet. Once they understood your program and they trusted you, then that's when they were able to find the funding for the project.
Definitely. And look, I love democracy. I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression, but definitely democracy has a huge weakness, and it is those 4-year cycles. If I'm an autocrat and I'm in charge for 20 years, fine, I'll create an awesome 20-year plan. If I'm a politician, and you look at the US, it's an even shorter cycle because you've got midterm elections. Right. In the middle, you've got 12 to 18 months to hit the ground or to have your impact. So there's definite challenges there. But I think your point about risk management as an enabler, it's not a cost. It's an enabler. No one says, sales cost us money. Marketing costs us money. Of course they do, but we recognize that's an essential part of business. And so is risk management. And you can pursue more opportunities, more sales in more markets, and you can avoid risks that your competitors. That's great. I say to our clients, crisis, instability, volatility, we're in a perma crisis. That's fine. Of course, there's sad stories and there's unfortunate things that come out of that. I don't want to sound dismissive, but these things are hitting us and they're hitting our competitors.
Right.
So if we've got better risk management processes in place, if our enterprise risk management and our enterprise security risk management is stronger, we'll come out ahead, guys.
Mm-hmm.
This is not all bad.
Yeah, it's ironic. It's like you can read my screen, because that was my very next question is, if you're good at risk management, it is a tactical and strategic advantage for your organization. And how do you get a company to go there? Just pivoting a little bit, because we were talking about the field of cybersecurity versus risk management a little bit. You've got a child and he's growing up. At some point, he's going to need a job too. What would you suggest for somebody looking at the myriad of options in front of them? Like, how would one get into risk management, and is it a good career?
That's a really interesting question. I think that's a great question, and I think there's a lot of different angles. I mean, historically, a lot of companies have just gone, you're in the military or you're in the police, you'll be a great risk manager. I strongly disagree with that. Now, as you heard, I was in the military. I was in the police.
Yes, sir. I was going to say.
I've also got 2 master's degrees. I've also got 2 diplomas, and I also spent a lot of time studying. And a lot of that is just making sure I've got the knowledge to be able to engage at a mature level with my clients. So I don't necessarily think that we should just be looking at the person that was a beat cop in Alberta or Toronto and assuming that she can automatically be a risk manager because she, attended 200 burglaries in her career.
Yeah.
And in fact, if I can tell you how we do it at 2Secure, it's much better for us to recruit someone from McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, Bain, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, PwC. I'm sorry, all those companies, that's where I'm trying to steal all my next recruits from. But it's much easier to teach those people who understand business, who understand how to understand a client's needs, risk and crisis management. It's easier to do that than it is to teach a police officer business. That's our personal experience, and it's my personal experience as well. But that's certainly something, I think, understanding the customer. And you talked about that before. With any project, and it can vary from 2 days to 2 weeks, but the first part of any project I do with a new client is I'm like an intern at that company. I'm just understanding, how do they milk the cows? How do they generate the electricity? How do they manage their forests? How do they mine that product? Whatever it is, I'm like an intern just understanding their business. And then, and only then, can I start adding value as an advisor to that company. So I think understanding the actual business objectives. Too many risk management teams I work with or I give advice to and I support say no, it's too risky. No, the security is too dangerous. No, there's too much. It's too hard to prepare for that sort of a crisis or that sort of risk exposure. And I continually say to them, that's the wrong answer, guys. Your answer should be, if that's what the business wants to do, then we will support that. There's going to be costs, there's going to be time, there's going to be analysis that's needed. But if that's what the business needs to do, then we will be that enabler that will make sure you can do that. And I think that's what people who want to get into risk management should be looking. I think a financial background is great. I think a business background is great. Of course, there's always security, there's risk management, there's geopolitical subjects you can add into your degree, there's protective security topics you could be studying. Add that into your degree as well and start getting involved in business. I think that's the strongest way.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I definitely am going to be following your research and stuff going forward.
Yes, sir.
I think that's part of what I love about the podcast is we get to learn about other ways that risk is showing up in business and in life. And so I can't thank you enough for your time today. I know we caught you between meetings as the AI helper, but truly a wonderful fount of information for our folks. So we're looking forward to getting this episode out. So thank you again for your time on this.
Gentlemen, it was a real pleasure, and I love the work you're doing, and I really, thank your listener base for listening, and also listening to your podcast. It's great work. So thank you very much for the time, and it was great to meet you both.
Thanks so much, Dominic.
Excellent. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the latest podcast from Caffeinated Risk. Make sure you visit our website, caffeinatedrisk.com, to stay up to date on what we've been working on. Our website has bios of our podcast guests, posts about topics we're passionate about, and even a library of reference material we find valuable in the work we do every day. And don't forget to subscribe to Caffeinated Risk on your favorite podcast service. This way, you'll be notified when we release our next podcast, and you can listen to our previous guests just in case you missed them. Thanks so much for listening to Caffeinated Risk.